today I'm beginning in a kind of continuing what we've been talking about for the last several weeks. We've been looking at the idea that, God wants us to move forward. In that moving forward, there's also spiritual warfare that we need to deal with. Pastor Delson last week talked about prayer. And I want to talk on that topic, and it's going to take me a couple of weeks to really get through what I want to be able to say on this idea. But I want to deal with the issue of ecclesia prayer. Ecclesia prayer, a little different than just our personal prayer. When we talk about corporate prayer, about coming together, there's something that's different about that. We might be able to be 2 or 3 in some place, and that's fine. That's a good thing. Any prayer is a good thing. Amen? But there's a special aspect of prayer, and I want to look at this because prayer has many dimensions. It's both personal as well as corporate. And it's internal in our hearts, and at the same time it's external in public display and proclamation. So we're going to look at this, and so I feel like I can't accomplish this in 1 week. But I want to set a foundation for what we see, because God's Word has unity from beginning to end. And sometimes, we get into the idea of New Testament theology, and we almost divorce everything from the past. And when we do so, we lack the strength and the endurance of what God really was trying to show us through that time. And so let me just pray with me this morning. Lord, I just ask you for your strength today for myself so that I could communicate what you've given to me, that my spirit would override my body, so that I would be able to stand and trust, Lord God, that you're going to do what you need to do in our midst. Help us to have the ears to hear, a mind that can grasp these truths, so that we can walk with power and might in the dominion that you've purposed for us. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. So we have personal as well as corporate prayer, which is important for us to understand. There's something that God does inside of us, and at the same time, it needs to be displayed outside of us. So both of these dimensions are critical for us to understand in our present day. If we're going to be the remnant, if we're going to see ourselves as the remnant of God influencing the culture around us. If we would unite our hearts under the focus of the model prayer from Jesus that he taught to his disciples, we can, as the people of God from many churches, even across denominational lines, see a measure of the kingdom of God come forth in our generation. And this is possible if we would take our positions as citizens of Christ's kingdom, who assemble and represent. Here we are represented or representatives of heaven, even though we're here on the earth. And so when we're doing so, we're spiritually legislating and we're proclaiming on earth what's already been decreed in heaven. Some of the scriptures that I'll start with, just because we're familiar with it. When the disciples asked Jesus how to pray, he gave them this manner of prayer in Matthew 6. He said, "Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name." Then he says, "Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as is in heaven." So we have this first aspect of our prayer, acknowledging who Jesus is, who the Father is. And then we're saying, making a declaration, let your kingdom come, let your will be done. What's happening in heaven, let it happen in the earth. And then we go on, and yes, then we get into our whole aspect of daily bread and forgiving and all the pieces, because that's all part of walking in the kingdom of God. So we call this posture of prayer ecclesia, after a Greek word that was used by Jesus in Matthew 16 and Matthew 18 for the building of his church. Now, it's important for us to understand, Jesus could have called his church a synagogue. If he would have called the church synagogue, his focus would have been where they met. But because he called his church the ecclesia, he was referring to the function of the church. about what the church was to be. And that's not dependent on the building. It's really who we are as people of God. When Jesus spoke in Matthew 16, remember when he was addressing Peter, he says, "Who do men say that I am?" Some say John the Baptist, some say prophet, some say Elijah. "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus turned to him and said, "Flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father which is in heaven." But then he says in verse 18 and 19, "And I say unto you, you are Peter. And in this rock, or on this rock, I will build my church," ecclesia. "And the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. And I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Now, there can be a real misunderstanding in this prayer, or this declaration that Jesus said. Because the first appearance, and I'm reading from the New King James, and I think the American Standard has a better translation of this, but it says, "Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven." It's almost saying like this, that whatever you declare, we'll have to agree with. That's not what it's saying here. When it's saying, "Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven," it's saying, those things that are already bound in heaven, when you declare them on earth, they will be bound. And those things that are already loosed in heaven, when you come into agreement with heaven and you declare those things, they will be loosed. See, the other way would almost seem like you are trying to change God's mind. How many know that real prayer is God trying to change our mind? He's trying to change our way. He's trying to change the way we're doing things. Again, he says this in Matthew 18, verse 17 to 20. And this one was in the context of relationships. It was in the context of people walking in the character of God as a people of God. And then he says, when somebody's offending another, there's a means of going to them and dealing with this. And so, after you've gone individually and the person hasn't changed, and you've gone 2 or 3 and the person still hasn't changed, it says here, if he refuses to hear them, beginning of verse 17, and that means a 2 or 3, tell it to the church. Again, the word here, ecclesia. And if he refuses to hear the church, let him be to you like a heathen and a tax collector. Assuredly, I say to you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Notice the same words that he said in chapter 16. Again, I say to you, if 2 of you agree on earth concerning anything that they ask, it will be done for them by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, I am there in their midst. Jesus is describing, or he described his disciples as those who gathered as a legislative body, like a Greek state, who met several centuries before his coming. Now, the origin didn't just happen in the Greek. He's using the word that the Greek would understand here, through the translation of the Bible. But we're going to go back into Genesis and see where the real foundation of all this thing is. But the concept of ecclesia goes back further than Greece. It's described as a spiritual position of the Israelites at the base of Mount Sinai, and the nature of the political structure known as the Hebrew Republic. So when Jesus is delineating the church, the ecclesia, it's a continuation of the spiritual and natural function of the congregation of Israel. You say, well, why is this history lesson important? It's really important for us to be able to understand the foundation of what Jesus is saying. If not, we just start praying prayers that don't really mean anything. We understand what we're praying for. If God's people would embrace this understanding, what it means to meet and pray as a church, whether we're doing it in our local area or regional, it would inspire us to rise up to our position as spiritual priests and kings. In Revelation chapter 1, verse 6, that Jesus made us kings and priests to his God. And to him be glory and dominion forever and ever. So God created man and woman in his image with responsibilities on the earth. What was the origin of the kind of assembly we call ecclesia. This is what we're searching for. And it's something that I want to build a foundation for so that when we come to the full knowledge, we'll understand what it means to meet together in a corporate body, to be able to come with corporate prayer. In Genesis 1, verse 26 to 28, we read this. God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over everything that creeps around upon the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. And he blessed them. And God said unto them, "Be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth and subdue it." So first, we see in this passage several truths that are worth remembering. First, God says, "Let us make man in our image." In other words, this is a triune God in action. Let us make man in our image. God, by his very nature, models for us three functions of government. We see the Father, which is legislating. We see the Holy Spirit as the executor, and the judicial, the one who's going to judge all things, is the Son. As well as bringing them together in harmony, the concepts here of what we see growing out in the government that we study later on, the many, the one and the many, the unity and diversity, that God begins to build this right from the beginning. And just as the isolation of powers has corrupted governments into extremes, how many times we see most governments are monarchical? It's one leader. Some are aristocracy, which means just a few, and others are democracy, which is the many. So this monotheism or monism is extreme oneness or isolation, and polytheism is extreme diversity, having corrupted the image of God in the earth. And so these are things that we see in present governments as we are trying to build. How can we be the image of God in the midst of a culture that we live in? So God says here, we are made in his image. In other words, we have a responsibility to bear the image of God's character in the earth where we live. And right from the beginning, men, what we say generic here is men and women together. We were created unique from the rest of creation. We were created with moral and rational responsibilities. And part of those were to steward the earth that God's given to us. We were created to enjoy God's presence, but also to fulfill the responsibility of taking dominion, or in the Hebrew word is radash, which simply means he's called us to rule. Third thing we see in this opening scripture in Genesis is that we're to steward or manage the earth, and this would include the responsibility of taking dominion. The idea of this dominion has some different parts. The first part is that we're called to be fruitful and multiply. In other words, God has given us a responsibility to promote and respect life. Some of you, I think this is the last week for our bottles here that we're doing, but the idea that we're not only supposed to respect life, we're supposed to promote life. The very first right that God gives in the Bible is the right to life. However, along with the right comes a corresponding responsibility to protect life, to preserve life. The second responsibility says is replenish the earth. This simply means to fill up. And this is literal. It's also figurative. It's such things as, you can also fill up the earth with sin. You can fill up the earth with violence. Or you can fill up the earth with peace. You can fill up what God's calling us to fill it up, but he's also an indication that to fill something is to be productive with the land, with the filling up the land, filling up the tabernacle, the things that God has given us to do. It indicates filling the culture with productive skills so that it leads to tools and technology and prosperity. In order to increase technology of all kinds, we need to have the freedom of choice. We have to have the ability to take the resources that we find on the earth and reproduce them in a different form. We call this God-given right and responsibility liberty. So God's given us, these are unalienable rights, right? Life and liberty. Where do you think you've heard things like this before? The third responsibility, God says, subdue the earth. And the Hebrew word is the word kabosh. It means to bring it into bondage. And maybe when you think of this word, you're getting the wrong idea, but he's referring to plants, he's referring to animals, and maybe you think it's like a tyrannical image, but that's a misapplication of the word because it means to own the responsibility for stewarding something we've been given. As I deal with people, and whether it's Christian people or unchristian people, this idea of really taking responsibility. You have leadership. Take responsibility for your leadership. Take responsibility for what you're supposed to do. People tend to blame shift, and they just kind of wait around. If we're going to be the kind of people that God's called us to be, we have to steward what we have. We have to take responsibility for what we have. Take ownership of the earth as God's steward. So now we're responsible for property. Life, liberty, and property. And the measure of how we influence our culture is determined by how the culture cultivates a respect for life, preserves liberty of choice, and protects the ability to own property. So we have to ask this first question: how well are we doing this among ourselves? Promoting life, growing in liberty, taking care of our property. And secondly, how have we modeled and influenced the culture around us to promote these values? I grabbed this little Bible that I have because it has references to both the Declaration of Independence and also the Constitution in the back of it. And you got to look at this Declaration of Independence and wonder, it's like, where do these words come from? When you read it, was it just by happenstance that this declaration was said? That when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitled to them, a decent respect for the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which implement them to be separated. So he's saying here, right at the beginning of this declaration, there's times when we need to separate from other governments. But if we do separate from other governments, we ought to be able to state why we're doing such a thing. For, here's the answer, for we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, then when any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it's the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and institute a new government, laying its foundation on such principles or organizing its powers in such form as they deem seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. What is it saying here? It's saying here that when we move, this is our Declaration of the United States for our own independence. Say, when we move away from the principles that we find that already have been given to us by God, those that are the consent, the government by the consent, in other words, we as the people, we're not being ruled from the top down, we're being ruled from the bottom up. We have a consent. And it behooves us as people to reorganize or change the government that we have so that it lines up more fully with what God's government is. When you start thinking about how are we supposed to influence culture, this is part of what we have to understand, because even the prayers that we pray, when we start making declarations of prayer, we have to understand what is it that undergirds us as the people of God. How are we supposed to function? So let me look at the calling of Abraham. About 500 years after the great flood, around 2000 BC, God calls Abraham, or Abram, out of Ur of the Chaldeans to follow him. He called Abram to separate himself from the ideology of his culture, his native culture, that he might prepare to increase life, liberty, and prosperity in the earth. In Genesis 12, 1-3, it states this: "And the Lord had said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and I will make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless you, and I will curse him that curseth thee, and in thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed." So Abram, who would become Abraham, the name means father of nations, he was called out to receive God's blessing. However, the purpose of his separation wasn't so he would be isolated. He was called out to be blessed so that he could become a blessing. You know, God always calls his people out of their culture spiritually to prepare them to be both with an attitude of love and an action of service to be a blessing, or in essence to transform people positively as a result. God's pulling us out of a culture so he can shape us so that we can be a blessing back in the culture to do something of value for him. And we must receive from God so that we can give back. Yeah, I know it's always more popular to receive than it is to give. You know, to receive something, and then we forget about the sacrifice and the training necessary that God calls us so that we can be a blessing to others. But the scripture is clear about this. There are conditions for receiving, and there are also conditions for giving. And the condition for receiving the blessing from God, he called with circumcision. In Genesis 17:10, it says, "This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your descendants after you. Every male child among you shall be circumcised." So initially we see in the gathering of God's people natural circumcision. But it's still true spiritually, because there's a spiritual circumcision which is conversion. In Romans 2:29 it says, But he is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is that of the heart in the spirit, not in the letter, whose praise is not from men but from God. So the condition for being a blessing was deeper and would require much more dedication and discipline. God's saying, you need to separate yourself. In the Old Testament here under Abraham, it was circumcision that marked that difference. In the New Testament, it's the circumcision of the heart, it's conversion. If one isn't converted, they're not part of the assembly to stand as a citizen. In order to be a citizen, you must come in according to the way God calls us to come in. There's a circumcision. There's a circumcision of the heart. It is a condition for being a blessing. It's a condition for you to be blessed. And so Abraham was called out to be blessed by God, and he would be a blessing to generations, so that in time the nations of the earth would be blessed through what God would do through Abraham. It says in Genesis 18:19, "For I have known him in order that he may command his children and his household after him, that they keep the way of the Lord to do righteousness and justice, that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has spoken to him." So here's the requirement to be a blessing, is to have a deep walk with God, deep enough so that we can train our children in such a way that they also will train their children. 3 generations of work here. And so the goal is that every generation might know, what does a righteous culture look like? In other words, as it is in heaven. And then strategically know how to bring a measure of that kingdom here on the earth. If we don't even understand what the kingdom of heaven's like, how can we bring a measure of that on the earth? It really requires a capital investment in character development, having a multi-generational vision. It is to this promise that the book of Galatians describes the New Testament believer and the church when he says, In Galatians 3, verse 6 to 8, just as Abraham believed God, it was accounted to him for righteousness. Therefore know that only those who are of faith are sons of Abraham. And the scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, preached the gospel of Abraham beforehand, saying, in you all the nations shall be blessed. So the people of God were called to separate themselves from the influence of culture, as God is calling us to do in our own day, for the express purpose of preparing us to bless the nations of the world. There's a reason why you're separate. They were separated unto God. They were learning the statutes and decrees of heaven so they could be a blessing to the nations of the world through prayerful service and through influence on the earth. And the result would be that there would be a progressive increase of the right and responsibility of life, liberty, and property in the nations of the earth. So the initial goal was for Israel to be an example of what it was like to live in a culture where Jehovah is king and his law is obeyed. This is the Greek word ekklesia. The people of God were to learn how to govern themselves and influence culture. So this is the first part. You see, God's called us out, but he needs to train us so that we know how to operate within his kingdom culture, not our own culture, so that we can influence the culture we live in. That means there's some changing that needs to happen in our lives, right? There's some mind changing that has to happen. There's a heart changes that need to happen. So we move from Abraham, we move to the Hebrews. God raised up Moses about 500 years after he called Abraham. So now we're at like 1500 BC. And after miraculously saving Moses from destruction as an infant and having his mother miraculously raise him in the Pharaoh's court, it says in Hebrews 11, 24 to 25, when Moses came of age, he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasure of sin. Moses made a choice. He chose to be separate. Even in being separate means that he could no longer enjoy the great lavish lifestyles of Egypt, but instead he would join himself to the suffering of his own people. The rights and responsibilities that were given to Adam and Eve to propagate and preserve life, to promote liberty, to acquire property in the earth, to steward before God, now will receive the protection of righteous civil laws in a nation formed by God. God called Israel, and now he's going to give him his laws to protect those things which he's already declared. So the return of Moses, deliverance of the Israelites from the Egypt, and the journey to the base of Mount Sinai to receive the Ten Commandments was a pivotal point in history, because the nations that did not respect Jehovah, they granted privileges to the few. They curtailed choice. They protected governmental power from the influence of the people. Does it sound like today? Some of the things that we say. See, life, liberty, and choice and property were limited to the nobles, to the elite, to the powerful. There's only some that were able to enjoy this kind of a thing. And it's important to note that right and wrong from God existed before any written law was ever defined. The writing of the law just makes all what was universally accountable, to come to bear, so that we understand what that is. Because it says in Romans 5, verse 13 to 15, until the law, sin was in the world. But sin is not imputed when there's no law. Nevertheless, death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over those who had not sinned, according to the likeness of the transgression of Adam, who is a type of him who was to come. But the free gift is not like the offense, for by the one man's offense many died. Much more the grace of God and the gift by the grace of the one man, Jesus Christ, abounded to many. It says in 1 John 3:4, whoever commits sin also commits lawlessness, because sin is lawless. So even before there was a law that actually codified that said this is what was wrong, it was already known inbred that this was wrong. It was already wrong. You don't have to make a law to say it's wrong, to already know it's wrong, because the wrong had to do with God's character. The common law, the law of the land that we see in Genesis 4:10 said that the voice of your brother's blood is crying out for me from the ground. In other words, the murder of Abel by Cain was wrong from the beginning, even before the murder was forbidden in a civil law. The earth is symbolic here of subsequent consequences embedded by God, cried out against. We read that in Numbers, for instance, where certain sins or murder, where it cries out from the ground. It says in Numbers 35:33, you shall not pollute the land where you are, for blood defiles the land, and no atonement can be made for the land, for the blood is shed on it, except by the blood of him who shed it. Can you imagine that when God says the blood that's been shed on the land cries out? I wonder in our own day. I start looking at statistics, and you see what happened with German occupation, and we see what happened through communism and all the lives that have been lost in the wars and the death camps and all of these things. And yet in our own nation, it exceeds far above that, just the babies that have been aborted in our land, the blood that's been shed. That is crying out from the ground. It's polluted our grounds. It says in Exodus, the congregation here, God called them to be a kingdom of priests and kings. And so in Exodus 19, verse 5 and 6 says, therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people. For all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. The congregation of Israel was to act as priests first and then king. It was important for us to kind of follow this. They were an ecclesiastical body, but they were also a civil body. They had this vertical dimension before God, just as we are to have our vertical dimension before God. They also had this horizontal dimension before men. The law itself was written by God on 2 tablets. The first 4 commands were written on one. The second 6 commands were written on the other one. The first 4 defined their relationship to God. The other 6 defined their relationship to men. These 2 tablets can be seen almost like church and state. It's a jurisdictional separation, but it's not an isolation. There's 2 tablets, and not what we learn about the separation of church and state today. The congregation of Israel was an ecclesiastic body where local priests ministered to the people, and they taught them to obey God's law. So the people were a diverse group of people. They were not all Jews by birth or by lineage. They had to lawfully become part of Israel. How they become part of Israel? Well, every male child had to be circumcised. We've already looked at some of those aspects. It says in John 10:1, most assuredly I say to you, he who does not enter the sheepfold by the door, but climbs up some other way, the same as a thief or robber. There's a way to come in, just like there's a way for us to be part of the kingdom today. So this ecclesiastical structure was a decentralized structure where religious leaders were identified as an offering of the people to God. It was the people that chose the leaders that actually represented them, which we see today. Unfortunately, if the character of the people are not good, what kind of leaders are you going to have? It was the people who ordained the priesthood into ministry. The leaders functioned by consent. You understand what it's saying here? They were functioning by the consent of the people. Each individual was considered a priest before God, and those that represent us are representing us because of the consent of the people. It's not because somebody all of a sudden had this top-down idea of government. And so the congregation of Israel also acted as a king. So we have this priestly ministry where we're ministering to the Lord and we're ministering to the people by teaching them the laws of God. But we also act as a king by joining lawfully. We become part of this civil body so that we would fulfill, and there were certain requirements for that. Interesting, that an immigrant could become part of Israel, by two things. He had to submit to the laws of Israel. The other thing is he had to learn the language of Israel. How can you, today we almost like try to make this so multicultural, but there's a culture. There's a way. You want to keep your language, fine, but you have to learn the language of the people to which you are joining with. And so there's a certain structure. But every individual was a king before God. You probably don't know that, huh? You're a king. That's what Allah says. But sometimes you think you're a king because you think you can do anything you want to do. That's not what he's talking about here. God instructed Moses to set up a government. You read it in Exodus 18 and Numbers 7, and let me just try to condense this down. There's the rule of the one, which we say is monarchy. There's the rule of the many, that's democracy. There's the rule of the few, which is aristocracy. But when God called Moses to form this government, there was a balance of these three powers: executive, legislative, judicial. Again, where do you see some of the things that we have, even in the forming of our own nation today? So God led Moses to construct a government that would operate by the rule of law. He combined and he blended the best features of monarchy, aristocracy, democracy, and the most common form at the time of the Hebrew Republic was monarchy. Everyone was ruled by kings. And when they were ruled by kings, they had very little respect for life. They had very little respect for liberty or choice. And they didn't have any respect for property for the people. They're the ones that controlled it. Oftentimes when a monarch rules, he rules by the divine right of kings, which basically makes him a god on the earth. So we worship the government instead of understanding the government that God's called us to do. So Moses was like the president of the Commonwealth. And so it's important for us to understand that when we begin to think of us as the people of God, he called together the people. And we see like a House of Representatives being formed. We see the Senate being formed. Our Reverend E.C. Wines, a theologian of the 19th century, made a comment of the passage that we see here in Deuteronomy 1. He says, "No fact can be plainer or more certain than that judges instituted at the suggestion of Jethro were chosen by the suffrages of all Israel. The direction of Moses to the people upon that occasion is very explicit. His words are, 'Take you wise men and understanding and know among your tribes that I will make them rulers over you.' The meaning is, you elect the proposed offices, I will commission them and induct them into office. It's very observable that these magistrates were to be taken out of all the people and not out of a privileged class." Now, here's the thing. In Exodus 19:8, kind of a key piece, and I don't know how much further I can get today. When the Lord brought his law through Moses to the people, and there were not only the representatives of the tens and the hundreds, the many, there were also the 70 that were with him, as well as were the priests. It says in 19:8 that all the people answered together, "All that the Lord hath spoken we will do." So Moses brought back the words of the people to the law. In other words, God has his law. It's both ecclesiastical, priesthood, and it's civil, kingships. We're called to be priests and kings unto God. But this was voted on by the people by consent. Everything you've told us, this is what we're going to do. Now, look, even if they didn't say that, he's Lord. He's God regardless of what our consent is. His law is supreme, whether you consent to his law or you don't consent to his law. But it's covenantally binding when it's done by consent, and God desires a freedom of choice. So he presents this law, and he presents to the people saying, you are called out to be separate so that you can then become a blessing. You are called out to learn my ways, to learn my laws, to operate under my covenant so that you can then influence nations with what you've learned. So in this first ecclesia, this first ecclesia assembly, the people decreed his law as valid back to him. In other words, a decree from the earth would agree with the one that's already been made in heaven. Why is this significant? It's the first ecclesia assembly, a formal meeting of the congregation of Israel at the foot of Sinai in covenant with God, where Israel functioned both as priests and kings. I am so much needing to continue to bring this to clarity, but let me just say this. God wants us to operate as a church. What he's taught us when he says these words, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. It's not just some name it and claim it kind of a thing. What it's saying is that you are my covenant people whom I have chosen, and I have separated you out of the world. In your priestly function, now, you must minister to me and you must minister to the people. It's important that we as the people of God learn God's ways. Learn what he requires of us. Begin to allow him to shape our lives so that, first of all, we're changed. We can't legislate anything to the world. We're not called to legislate to the world. We're called to be an influence to the world so that we can help the world understand what it means to preserve life, to walk in liberty, to take care of property. But we must first be able to do that for ourselves. But when we come together as a congregation, when we come together in corporate prayer, what we're saying is we're operating under the principles of what God has already taught us. And so now, Lord, release your liberty, release your life, release the ability for people to have property as we begin to be an influence for those around us. See what the children of Israel did, the church in the wilderness, this ecclesia. They were functioning like an Old Testament church. We have to learn from this idea. There's a significance here. In fact, even Stephen recounts this in Acts chapter 7 when he says, he recalled how Moses was used by God in the nation's miraculous deliverance from Egypt. And he quoted Deuteronomy 18:15. He says that Jesus was the promise. He's like the Moses number 2. You know, Moses the first is the one that led them out of Egypt. Jesus, who would going to come again, would lead us out of this world, lead us out of the grip of Satan. That Moses accomplished the nation, admonished the nation to hear the words which this prophet would say. Stephen's now speaking to the church. He's speaking to those, and he said, here's what Moses was saying. You need to hear the words of God and operate under the words of God so that you can be the influence to the nations of the world. Why? Because the people that Stephen was speaking to was trying to rule over the world. They just wanted some Messiah to come to be another king. But see, we have to understand our role as a priest first ministers to God. I mean, there's so many scriptures you can look. Acts chapter 13, as they ministered to the Lord then spoke to them, send out. See, there's a ministry, a priestly ministry, that opens the door for the kingly ministry that God's called us to. Okay, I can't go anymore. We have two identities. We have a heavenly identity, but we have an earthly identity. We spoke about how we need to know where we're seated. That's the heavenly identity. But then we need to walk a walk worthy. That's the earthly identity. You know, it's after you understand that heavenly identity and you begin to walk the walk worthy that now you're able to stand against the wiles of the enemy. Now you can begin to be the king that God's called you to be in the earth. just as Abraham was called out by God. And then he prepared Abraham to influence his culture and be a blessing. These two functions were retained by the children of Israel in the congregation in the wilderness. We always have these two identities. They were the church of the Old Testament, but it sets the standard for the church of the New Testament to function as saints. We are both kings and priests unto God. It's interesting in the book of Revelations that we are both a bride, that's our priestly ministry, and we're also a city, that's our kingly ministry. When in Revelations 21, verse 1 to 3, where the final picture of the church is a bride coming from heaven and a city on the earth. Just as it is in heaven, let it be here on the earth. It says in Revelations 21, verse 1 to 3, Now I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and also there was no more sea. Then I, John, saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from heaven saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men. He will dwell with them, and they shall be his people. God himself will be with them and be their God. Israel functioned as both priests unto God and kings. God's calling us to function as priests and kings. When we begin to understand that, there are two different jurisdictions. One is our ministry to the Lord and to each other. When we come together on Sunday, what are we trying to do? We're trying to shape ourselves to understand what is the law of God? What is the character of God? What are the things that God holds and esteems? Life is precious. We need to preserve it. You know, choice is important. That's why God gives us a choice whether to be part with him or not with him. You know, conversion makes us part of the kingdom. Property is important. We are called to steward the earth. There's so many scriptures, so many places in the book of Psalms that talk about the righteous inheriting the earth. If you really understood that you are to inherit the earth, I think you'd take better care of it. Just think about the house you're living in now. If somebody's going to give that to you after you lived in it for 20 years. You know, some people rent property and it's like, they don't care. They're just ruining somebody else's property. What if that's going to be your inheritance? Maybe you take better care of it. When we gather together corporately, we're the ecclesia of God. We're the ecclesia. What we do together is important. We're standing, declaring those things that God's already declared. We'll get a little bit more into this in terms of the New Testament application, but I want us to see that all the way through what God's done in principle in the Old Testament is what we begin to see revealed in the New Testament. God's called you as a priest. He's also called you as a king. You cannot have any influence as a king until you first learn his laws as a priest. Our first role is to minister to him. As we minister to him, we must minister to one another. God, change our hearts. God, change our mind. Change our habits. Change the things that we're doing so that we can be an influence. He separated us to bless us. Not just so that ends there, but so that we can come under his discipline, come under his training, come under his tutelage, so that we can be a blessing. I think that's why he used the word ecclesia and he didn't use the word synagogue. There are churches all over America that are joining as churches. It's the place you go. But they've lost the function of why they joined. May we not lose this function. Yes, God's called us as priests, but don't forget the second aspect. He's also called us as kings so that we can show what it means to rule and reign in his likeness, creating influence so that those areas in our culture that don't preserve life, that don't offer choice, that don't enable stewardship of property, we can help to change through our own knowledge, through our own witness. You are light. Don't be hidden. You are salt. Don't be distasteful. You're a city. Notice those three things. Salt and light has to happen internally. It's to be seen. But then there has to be a model of government that will able to have people see the kingdom of God for our generation. May we learn as we continue to look at this why we need to come together, not just to pray for our hangnails, but to really pray that the community around us will change. But the community around us can't change till we allow God first, to allow us to be serious with him, allow him to change us too. Lord, we just thank you as we prepare for communion, Lord, that you would touch our hearts. Enable us, Lord, by your power to understand. We've been given a great holy calling, and we want to walk in the privilege of walking with you. So touch us, Lord, today, that we begin to understand that just as Abraham was called, and then Israel was called, and then the New Testament church was called, so are we called today. Thank you. Thank you for reminding us. Help us to be the city that others can see, so that we can proclaim your praises to those around us. We just give you glory and we give you praise. Let your kingdom come on the earth as it is in heaven. We want to make that declaration today. In Jesus' name, amen.